AT-3 AM, Aktybinsk Air Base. The most secret aviation facility in Russia just took a direct hit, and the Su-57 was parked in the open. The steppe is still, the kind of pre-dawn stillness that only happens on the flat, treeless plains above the Caspian, where the wind stops moving for a few hours before sunrise and the air itself feels like it is holding its breath. On the wide concrete apron of the 929th State Flight Test Center, the base named for Valery Chkalov, the one every Russian pilot has been trained to call the beating heart of Soviet and Russian aviation. The most valuable aircraft in the Russian Federation are lined up under the open sky. No hangars, no hardened shelters, no roof. Just concrete and the darkness in the aircraft that took 20 years and roughly $10 billion to design, waiting for a morning that is about to arrive very differently than anyone on that airfield expected. Based on developing open source reporting from the overnight incident, here is my strategic assessment. Ask yourself something. If a country truly believed its rear was safe, would it build a fifth-generation fighter and then leave it outside like a rental car? Stay with me, because that single question is the entire story of what happened tonight. And it gets more serious from here. Let me walk you back to a marble situation room in Moscow 3 years ago. Vladimir Putin is sitting across from his generals. On the wall behind them is a slide with one word on it: sovereignty. In that briefing, the Russian Air Force was still the second largest combat aviation force on Earth. 1,000 frontline airframes, 240 air bases, and on the Volga steppe, a test and development pipeline that had been running continuously since Stalin, the pipeline that produced the MiG-21, the Su-27, the Tu-160, and every combat aircraft the Soviet Union and its successor state ever put into the sky. At the top of that pipeline was the Su-57, Russia's only claimed fifth-generation fighter, marketed to India, marketed to Algeria, marketed to every defense ministry from the Gulf to Southeast Asia as proof that Russian engineering could still stand in the same room as the American F-35 and the Chinese J-20. Fewer than 40 airframes exist in the whole world. Every one of them is what engineers call a boutique, hand-built, hand-fitted, impossible to replace at sanction-era speed. And Aktybinsk is where they live. I have watched Russian air power for more than 4 decades, as a professional and now as an analyst. Let me be direct about this. The 929th is not a substitutable facility. It is the single institution in the country where every Russian combat aircraft must first prove it can fly. Weapons trials happen here. Radar integration happens here. The envelope testing that turns a prototype into a certified frontline platform happens here. In one representative year in the late 90s, this base logged 191 test sorties on a single aircraft variant alone. That is not a runway. That is a national asset. And it just took a direct hit at 3 in the morning. Hold that thought, because in a few minutes, I am going to walk you through the arithmetic of what tonight cost each side, and the numbers are going to change how you look at every remaining month of this war. Now let me take you into what actually happened. The deep strike window in Russian territory runs between roughly 2 and 5 in the morning. It is the window every professional planner in the world knows and uses. Alert crews are at their lowest ebb, shift rotations overlap. Human attention curves are physiologically at their bottom. And on this particular overnight, Russian air defense was already stretched to its outermost limit. The Kremlin's own defense ministry announced this morning that it had shot down 325 Ukrainian drones over a single 24-hour window across 16 regions. Think about what that number actually means. You do not launch 325 platforms and hope every single one gets shot out of the sky. you launch 325 to guarantee that enough of them arrive. The Kremlin published that number as public reassurance. Every serious analyst on Earth read it as confession, and in the middle of that swarm, threading through the seams of a defensive picture saturated across half the country, a small subset of platforms reached the Volga steppe. Somewhere between 2 and 5 in the morning, they arrived over Akhtubinsk. The steppe offered no terrain to hide behind on the way in, but the same emptiness offered no obstruction either. Platforms flying at treetop height across hundreds of kilometers of flat farmland found the exact envelope of Russian radar coverage that the base assumed no one would ever exploit. Explosions were reported in the vicinity of the flight line. Regional social channels lit up, and within a few hours, open source confirmations were pointing at the 929th itself as the facility that had been struck. Then came the tell. Fighter Bomber, the Russian aviation link channel that has been the single most credible open source confirmer of prior damage at this exact base, went silent. That silence from the community that has cheered every Russian air defense success for 2 years is the pattern that has preceded every previous confirmation of damage at Akhtubinsk. Pause on that for a moment, because this is the second time this base has been struck. Not the second time in the war, the second time this year. The first strike, the year before last, produced Maxar satellite imagery that showed 3 Su-57s on the apron immediately before the attack. After the strike, imagery showed burn marks and a shrapnel crater right beside the cockpit of one of them. That was the first time in history a Russian fifth-generation fighter had been damaged on the ground. A follow-on strike weeks later damaged a Su-34 with 2 visible impact points and a fuel spill spreading across the concrete in Maxar's follow-up imagery. Both strikes happened on the same open apron, under the same non-existent shelter. And here is the part that makes this story unforgivable from a purely engineering standpoint. After the first strike, Fighter Bomber himself, a channel with genuine credibility inside the Russian aviation community, posted publicly what every honest Russian aviator was thinking. A hangar costs less than the aircraft it would protect. Build the hangars. Build them now. That plea went into a defense ministry that had spent decades building parade squares and marketing brochures. Nothing happened. 2 years later, the exact same vulnerability produced the exact same outcome. Now, I want you to hold on to something, because the mechanism has 4 layers. Layer 1 is tactical. Russia's premier test base has no hardened shelters. The most expensive aircraft in the country sit in configurations any Western Air Force retired from doctrine 40 years ago. When Fighter Bomber openly complained after the first strike that should have triggered a national shelter construction program, it did not. And the reason it did not is deeper than money. Layer 2 is doctrinal. Russian air defense cannot be strong everywhere across 11 time zones at once. Claiming 325 interceptions in one night while still losing the most sensitive aviation target in the country is not a defensive victory. It is a diagnostic of collapse. You can be strong at the front, you can be strong in the depth. You cannot be both against a saturation adversary that has learned to arrive in mass on multiple axes, on the exact windows when defenders are physiologically weakest. Layer 3 is institutional. 2 full years of visible warning did not produce hangars. A $10 billion program is being defended by open concrete. A mill blogger with a modest following understood Russian air defense priorities better than the Russian Defense Ministry did. That is not a budget problem. That is an institutional failure at the level of the entire military bureaucracy, and no decree the Kremlin issues in the next 12 months will fix it. Layer 4 is strategic. The Kremlin's entire deep rear is safe assumption, the doctrine that shaped basing decisions, logistics posture, and test infrastructure, citing for the whole post Soviet era, has just been empirically retired at the single most sensitive aviation facility in the Russian Federation. There is no combination of budget, construction, or air defense repositioning that reverses that reality on any timeline that matters to the war. There is a historical parallel worth naming briefly. In 1967, Operation Focus destroyed the Egyptian Air Force largely on the ground in a matter of hours. Every serious air force in the world absorbed one lesson from that morning: harden your airfields. The United States spent the following 40 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building hardened shelters across Europe. Russia, facing post Soviet budget collapse, skipped that investment outside a handful of strategic bases. 60 years later, Ukraine is reteaching the same lesson at a fraction of the cost, using platforms that individually cost less than a used pickup truck. Now, let me be precise about the arithmetic. Every Su-57 airframe is estimated at somewhere between 35 and $50 million in production cost. Export pricing has been pushed as high as 140 million per unit. Ukrainian long-range strike drones cost tens of thousands of dollars each. Even a 325 platform saturation wave costs less than a single Su-57. The ratio is conservatively 100 to 1 in Ukraine's favor, and it climbs sharply higher when you factor in disruption to test programs, delay to weapons certification, and export confidence damage that follows a fifth-generation fighter visibly burning on its own concrete apron. This is not warfare arithmetic. This is bankruptcy arithmetic. Ukraine can sustain this exchange indefinitely. Russia cannot. This single event is not isolated, it is the pattern. Implication 1. There is no safe rear anywhere in the Russian Federation. From Novorossiysk in the south, to Ust-Luga in the northwest, to Komsomolsk-on-Amur on the Pacific coast, to Astrakhan on the Caspian steppe, every point on the Russian depth map is now a target on somebody else's strike map. That is a strategic reality Russian planners have never had to face in the modern era. Implication 2. Russia's defense industrial base has become the battlefield. Refineries, propellant plants, aircraft factories, test centers. Ukraine has redefined what the front line means, and every industrial node that supports the war effort is now inside the envelope of somebody else's planning. When the industrial base is the target set, the classical distinction between front and rear ceases to exist. Implication 3. The Su-57's value as an export instrument is collapsing in real time. You cannot sell a fifth-generation fighter to the world while it burns on an open apron in your own country. Every prospective foreign customer of Russian combat aviation is recalculating tonight, and the recalculation is not favorable to the Kremlin's arms export business. For NATO, 3 lessons matter. Hardened shelters are not Cold War nostalgia. They are a present tense requirement. Cheap mass beats expensive exquisiteness, and any air defense architecture built for the previous generation of threats is going to be overwhelmed by the current one. And the speed at which a smaller state can find, fix, and finish deep targets is the model every Western staff college needs to be teaching next quarter. But the most disturbing part is what happens next. Expect satellite battle damage assessment inside 48 hours. Watch fighter bomber. His silence or his rage will tell you what actually stood on that apron. Expect Ukrainian long-range tempo to rise, not fall, as the country's Independence Day arrives inside the week. The strike calendar suggests Kyiv Times signature deep operations to symbolic dates, and with the coalition of the willing meeting in Kyiv the same day, The political weight of anything additional is going to amplify. Expect Russian authorities to publicly claim total interception while quietly issuing dispersal orders in the following weeks. That was the post-strike playbook the last time this base was hit. There is no reason to expect a different one this time. Putin has three bad options, and there are only three. Option one, harden every base. Build shelters across dozens of airfields. Cost years the war does not have, takes years the war does not allow, and the concrete arrives long after the drones. Option two, pull the fleet east. Disperse aircraft beyond the current Ukrainian long-range envelope, guts sortie generation, breaks maintenance chains, and concedes the entire Western Military District as contested airspace. Option three, concentrate air defense in the rear. Strip coverage from the front to protect the interior, hands Ukrainian aviation and the drone corps freedom of action over the battlefield itself. Every option loses something the Kremlin cannot afford to lose. The cascading effects compound. Every additional deep strike node hit degrades the others in the same industrial system. Russian millblogger anger erodes the information control narrative from inside as fighter bombers' constituency openly blames the defense ministry, and every prospective Su-57 buyer in the export market recalculates, taking the entire Russian arms export book down alongside the operational damage. 80 years ago, the measure of air power was how high and how fast. Today, the measure is whether a drone costing less than a used pickup truck can find your crown jewel on an open apron 600 kilometers from the front. Tonight, on the step above the Caspian, it did. And the country that spent $10 billion building that crown jewel could not manage to spend a fraction of that on the concrete roof that would have kept it safe. History will record that the Russian Air Force entered this war with a claimed fifth generation fighter and one of the proudest flight test traditions on Earth, and could not protect either of them on the ground in its own deepest rear, at the very base where its future was supposed to be built. In my view, we are watching the arithmetic of defeat compound one refinery, one frigate, one test center at a time. The Russians can no longer hide what they cannot protect, and what they cannot protect is now everything that matters. Tomorrow, I am walking you through the satellite battle damage assessment as it lands, and with Ukraine's Independence Day inside the week, my assessment is that Aktobinsk was the opening act, not the finale. You will not want to miss it.